This podcast is about introducing our fans to the animals, plants, and other products that we work with at Josh's Frogs. It's an opportunity to paint a picture of our hobby that is refreshing. We want you guys to be successful with the animals that you're keeping, and we want our hobby to grow ethically and sustainably into the future. Welcome to the Josh's Frogs podcast. Today we have a special episode where I'm actually the guest. But before we do that, I just wanted to let you guys know that the Josh's Frogs podcast is brought to you by joshsfrogs.com. We're your one-stop shop for all your reptile, amphibian, and pet insect needs. So not only are we captive breeding all the animals here at Josh's Frogs, but we're also supplying all the feeder insects, all the live plants, and all the dry goods, from tanks to lights to heating, all that kind of stuff. We want you to be successful, so we've created tons of videos, blogs, how-to articles to help you be successful. And then we have the most generous live arrival guarantee on both our animals, 7 days, and then on our live insects, 3 days on those ones. So check us out, joshsfrogs.com. But without further ado, here's an interview I did with Jesse at Bulk Reef Supply Fresh. Thanks.
Hi everybody, Jesse here with BRS Fresh. Today, super excited to have a very special guest in the studio. We have the man himself, Josh, from Josh's Frogs. Josh, thanks for coming.
Oh, I'm super excited to be here. Super excited to talk about aquariums and terrariums and to build some stuff with you guys.
Awesome, appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, well, we're kind of where you were, I want to say 20 years ago, right? Like, we're just getting started, which is probably kind of fun for you to see, like, you know, the beginning. And of course, we're part of a bigger organization that was started 15 years ago, but the fresh side of our business is just getting going. So and I want to go back to what that was like for you. Now, I read you started everything with flightless fruit fly culture, right? Like you were breeding those. But you were breeding them to feed your dart frogs. So I'm curious, like, why dart frogs, and how did that begin?
So I grew up by a swamp. We were catching all kinds of stuff and keeping it. My mom would let us keep anything for a night and then return it the next day, with the exception of being snapping turtles, of course. So I did that, and then in high school I graduated to like keeping some exotic snakes. I had ball pythons and a red-tailed boa constrictor. And once I went to college, I got rid of all that stuff. Did college, got out into the workforce, and I had a very extroverted job, which was a big drain on me. I'm a big-time introvert. And so I was in counseling, and the counselor's like, hey, you need a hobby. Like, you need to recharge yourself. You need to find something that you can do that doesn't involve people, that just recharges you. And so I brainstormed, and I was like, hey, you know what? I used to keep these exotic pets before. I'd like to do that again. And talked with my wife about it. She grew up in Africa, so she said no more snakes. Like I've done the snake thing for a while. I don't want any snakes in our house. So I said, okay, sounds good. And so I started looking at frogs, and I was looking at a bunch of different frogs, and most frogs tend to be nocturnal. So that didn't interest me just because they're not as active during the day. And so I was doing more and more research, and I stumbled upon poison dart frogs, which are diurnal, which means that they're around during the day, and just really got sucked into that hobby and was like, hey, yeah, I think I can do some stuff with this. So I got the frogs, got the tank set up in our living room. And my wife comes home from work. She was a substitute teacher at the time. Comes in and is like, why does our house smell like horrible? And I was like, oh, it's this fruit fly cultures. They smell horrible. And so I said, okay, I got to solve this problem. So I started doing a bunch of experiments. I would honey and vinegar and cinnamon and vanilla and more or less of some of the other ingredients that are part of it, brewer's yeast and sugar, and was going back and forth and trying to figure out like what's the perfect balance for these fruit flies. And got home. My wife got home a few weeks later. Walked into the house and was like, hey, what are you making? It smells really good in here. And I was like, hey, it's the fruit flies. They smell really good. And so that kind of kicked off Josh's Frogs when I was able to start bagging up some of that fruit fly media and start selling the cultures and to be able to contribute to the hobby and say, hey, you know, I've done some experiments. I think this is a good media. They'll keep the fruit flies from smelling horrid in your house. So.
I thought you created like a candle company,
exactly,
like vibe in your house.
Exactly.
But within your hobby, that's super cool.
Yeah.
I love it. Yeah. So dart frogs is where you settled. Yeah. And my understanding is that is your primary species of all the things that you sell.
Yep.
And is that largely because they are diurnal? Is that what attracts people to them, or what is it about dart frogs that makes them so popular for all your customers?
Great question. So I think the fact that they are diurnal is a big selling point, as opposed to something like red-eye tree frogs that are nocturnal. So I think that's a big selling point for them. I think their other selling point is that they're super bold and colorful. So it's kind of like hey, I didn't even know that a frog like that existed type expression that people have. And then I think also too, I think it's the idea that they were one of the first species in our hobby where people were like, hey, you can't keep them very simply. You need to do what's called a naturalistic setup with them. And that's the only way people were successful for them. And it kind of kicked off this whole hey, what is a terrarium and how cool can a terrarium be in our hobby? And so I think that draws people in. We find just as many people excited about the terrarium as we do about the animal.
So dart frogs, would you say they're the easier side of frogging, and is that a safe place for people to get into if they want to get into reptiles and amphibians?
So it used to be that we would tell people, hey, get a Pac-Man, get a White's tree frog. And we're seeing less and less of that. More and more people are starting with dart frogs. We just have dialed in their care so well, and there's so much information on how to take care of them. And a lot of the supplies are so readily available now that really anybody could read an article, do a little bit of research, and feel really confident about I'm going to set up these dart frogs in a way that they're going to be happy, healthy, and successful that way. And so we're seeing more and more people go to poison dart frogs as their first species because they just are out and about during the day. It keeps you engaged with the animal, and then when people are engaged with the animals, they take better care of those animals. And so we find the opposite true of a lot of the nocturnal animals, that the people are less engaged with those. It's a green blob on the cage side, all day long, and so people are less invested in those types of animals. And so we're finding people being more and more drawn as a beginner right to dart frogs.
Okay, so I had another question I was going to go to, but did you say poisonous?
Yeah, so...
Can we talk about that for a minute?
In the wild, they're eating ants that are eating poisonous plants, and that's where they get their toxicity. In captivity, they're totally harmless. So we're feeding them fruit flies. They don't have that toxicity. But the cool thing is they still think that they're poisonous. Okay. So they're out and about, hopping around, being super bold, not afraid of anything because they think that they're poisonous. But in captivity, they're totally harmless. And in the wild, the toxicity can range pretty broadly across the different species. So you have terribilis, which is the terrible poison dart frog, which will kill you. You touch it and touch your eyes or your nose, you're going to die. To some of the other ones that even if you ate it, you just get pretty sick, but you wouldn't die. So it can range pretty broadly in the wild, but in captivity, totally harmless.
That's amazing. So you get that experience of having this really cool animal that otherwise would be too dangerous. But because you guys breed in captivity, it's okay.
Yep.
And so what is the whole breeding in captivity scene look like for you guys? I know that that's really important. You don't do any wild caught species. So how does that come about for you? And what's maybe what's one of the latest things you're working on as far as what you're breeding?
Yeah. So poison dart frogs breed pretty regularly and pretty easily. They're not big spawners. They lay more clutches throughout a year. So some of the more common stuff, Tinctoria serratus, they'll lay eggs every 7 to 10 days. Small clutches, anywhere from 3 or 4 eggs all the way up to a dozen or so eggs. And so they breed pretty consistently around the year. And they're really easy to breed. A lot of the poison dart frogs don't need any cycling, don't need to have a cold spell and then a warm spell. They don't need extra feeding and then pull back the feeding. They don't need any those types of cues that a lot of other animals need. They just breed pretty regularly, which makes them a really cool frog for people to have experience breeding. So if you were keeping a red-eye tree frog, it's not impossible to breed them, but you have to do some stuff. You have to pull back some feeding. You have to cycle them. You have to move them out of the enclosure into a rain chamber. You have to do some stuff. Whereas poison dart frogs, if you just keep them fed, keep them healthy, and you have a male and a female, they're going to lay eggs and they're going to have babies. And so they're a very easy frog to breed, and really a part of our hobby in the reptile amphibian hobby that is growing. And so we're able to produce a lot of frogs. We'll produce hundreds of dart frogs every week, and still our hobby is just short on animals, and we're not the only people breeding them. There's just a big need for those types of pets as people get more and more engaged in keeping those kinds of pets.
Wow. So let's say, I'm curious what the journey looks like.
Yeah.
So you start with one of these poison dart frogs, right? That are not poisonous.
Yeah.
And then, what's the evolution from there? Like, let's say that's where you get in. It sounds to me like that probably has a range of being basic, but there's also maybe a more advanced way in which you can have dart frogs. But just where do you see people evolving to within reptiles and amphibians?
It's really interesting being old and being in the hobby for a couple of decades that we really see the progression of people in the hobby that I'm not sure that they see when they're getting into the hobby. So we like to say in the poison dart frog area, people usually follow along 3 different pathways. So everybody starts with the one tank, usually what we recommend a 20 high, and they start off with this one tank and they set it up for their dart frogs, and then they get hooked. And so then they fall into one of 3 different trains, and there can be some play in between those 3. The first one is they get those frogs and they're like, those are really cool, but I want the other color, and then I want the other color, and then I want the other color. So they build a wall with a racks, and they have a bunch of these 20 highs, and they've got maybe a dozen different dart frog species, and their whole mantra is like, I just want to collect them all. Like I just want to showcase the breadth of dart frogs that are available, and they go down that path. The second group of people get some dart frogs, and they start hearing about some of the other frogs that are a bit more difficult to breed or difficult to keep. And so they move from like, hey, I have some Tinctorius, Auratus, Leucomelis. I want to keep something that's a little bit harder to breed or a little bit harder to take care of. And so they move to species, their thumbnails, that maybe breed a little bit less frequently than some of the larger frogs. And then even some of the egg feeders too, the tadpoles that we can't feed a pelleted diet to, where the female has to feed the babies unfertilized eggs. And so those people move from, hey, these really simple dart frogs to some of the more complex dart frogs. And then the third group of people are the people that get into dart frogs, they set up the 20 high, and then they realize, man, I love this terrarium just as much as I love these animals. And so they say, hey, I'm going to do another tank, and now it's a 40-gallon. And then I'm going to do another tank, now it's 100 gallons. And then I'm going to do another tank, and I found an old shower, and I'm going to convert that into a terrarium. And then, hey, I want this walk-in greenhouse that I can do my frogs. And they get really passionate about the setup and how it looks, and creating something larger and more creative. So usually people fall into one of those 3 things, and they don't know it at the beginning. They're just keeping one tank of frogs, but we really see people go through those 3 different pathways, I guess I would call them.
That makes sense. We see that in freshwater too, right? You have people that might be on one side of the fence of where the fish is the hero, and that when somebody walks into their house, they want them to see the fish, right? And then everything else is sort of to accent or to be an accent for the fish. And then you have the other side of it where it's like, now the fish are just an accent to what I really want you to talk about is this beautiful aquascape, right? And that's what I want your attention on. So that's cool. That's an interesting crossover that I guess both of our hobbies have. I'm curious, just within maybe your customer group, maybe some of your employees, friends, what have you seen? Like, what are other areas in which aquatics, freshwater aquatics, and reptiles and amphibians cross over? Do you find there's interest on both sides of the fence and the folks that you know?
Yeah, definitely. I think on one way we see it happen is that people will keep freshwater aquariums or even saltwater aquariums, and they'll say, hey, I'd like to do some of the same stuff I'm doing in these hobbies in a more terrestrial type setup. Like I want to take this aquascaping and turning into some scaping on a terrarium. And they say, hey, it's almost like they're taking some art that they created in the freshwater space and like, hey, I'm going to tweak it and do it a little bit different and practice my craft in a terrarium where there isn't water. I think we also see some of the backwards going, or the opposite happening as well too, where people start with terrariums and say, hey, I think I could do some of this stuff really cool in an aquatic sense, and so they will broaden the tapestry for which they're creating this artwork to do it in both terrestrial and aquatic. And then I think we're seeing also with the growth of paludariums where people are doing both in the same terrarium. And so I think it's starting off in our hobby as very simple, like, okay, I'm a little bit nervous about how do I pull off this water feature with some areas for animals that are not aquatic. and I think there was some trepidation in that, and so we're seeing very simple setups in the paludarium. But I think of the last few years, we started to see people getting more comfortable and more creative when it comes to the paludariums, which is creating really unique environments for you to keep really unique types of animals, but also to create some really cool showcase type terrariums or paludariums inside people's houses that are really cool, where you have fish on the bottom and then some other terrestrial or arboreal animal on the very top of that terrarium, which are really cool. And I'm excited for what that means for the rest of our hobby.
That's awesome. Like I know that for me especially, I get really inspired by the aquascapes, like the DIY, the ability to create something that you find beautiful. And it sounds like people in reptiles and amphibians really have that same attraction to creating these environments or these biotopes. I'm curious, one of the things that I noticed in freshwater that I thought was kind of striking was like picture walking up and down the street and asking somebody to imagine a freshwater aquarium. Like, what do you think they're going to say, right? Or what do you think they're going to picture? It's going to be a pirate ship. It's going to be blue rock, right? And I don't think that this is what first comes to mind. And I think that that's something that people, essentially get wrong about what freshwater is. And then also, they think that this is so advanced that they can't do it, right? What do you think people in reptiles and amphibians just get wrong about the hobby? Because I think this can be very approachable to people who don't have a lot of experience, as long as they have the right resources and inspiration. What's that look like for you?
I think then in our hobby, people will sometimes get intimidated by some of the more experienced keepers that have maybe, like they're showcasing on Facebook their 20th terrarium that they've built. And that can be very intimidating when you're like, I've never built it before. I've never done a foam background before. Or I don't know how I would find the pieces of wood that make it look like what that person's doing. And so I think it's an opportunity for us to really showcase that terrarium building and keeping reptile and amphibians, and even in the aquatic space, it's an opportunity for us to try things with the idea that eventually we're going to get better and better at the ways in which we're setting these things up to not only provide better environments for our animals, but also just better looking enclosures. It's kind of like, I think we need to think of it more in lines of like artistry and creativity, that like, hey, your first terrarium will be really cool and it'll hold a unique place in your heart, but it won't be the best terrarium you ever build. And that's totally fine. Like, I think we're to the point now in our hobbies, whether that's freshwater or whether that's in the reptile and amphibian area, where we can know enough and we can provide people with enough that the animals are going to be taken care of really well. And you have to just be okay with like, hey, it's not going to look like what I saw on Facebook because that's that guy's 20th terrarium or aquarium that he's built. But like, we can get there. Like, it's not that hard. The more you practice, the more you set it up, the more you tweak things, the more you change things, the cooler it'll look. And like, I think that's a journey that people are a little bit intimidated by, but like, it's a journey that all of us are on. I don't think any of the people that are creating their 20th terrarium, like knew at the very beginning that they'd be able to create something like that. It takes practice. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I've actually been asked like, what's your favorite scape? And my answer is always the last one you just did. I mean, literally, you're so excited about the last one you just did, and then you do another one. You're like, actually, I think this one's my. So you're right. You evolve, but that's the passion. That's the fun of it. So what inspires you, right, to stay in this hobby? You're the largest poison dart frog breeding facility in the world. You've got a big business that you're running, but you obviously want to stay inspired. I'm curious, like, what keeps you motivated? What inspires you? Have you ever traveled somewhere where you gain inspiration from like the real world and what's going on out there? What's that look like?
So when you were first shaping that question, that's the first thing that I went to is that like really being outdoors, being in natural habitats does inspire terrarium building. And I think that's not only true of when I get to travel, so like when I'm in Honduras or when I'm in Mexico or when I'm in somewhere drastically different than the climate that we live in Michigan, that is inspiring. And that's like, oh, I love how this tree was falling down like this, and I love how the rocks look in this way. Like, that's inspiring. But I find that even in Michigan, like I'm going hiking and I'm like, oh, this is cool how the water runs down this waterfall like this, or it's really cool how this is set up, or it's really cool what this looks like, and then that inspires me. And then I think the other part of that is just being involved with groups online, whether that's Facebook groups or some email chains where people are showcasing what they created. And it's just an opportunity for me to be inspired by what they're doing and to try new things. So in our hobby, like people are always trying, like, hey, I've got this new type of wood or this new type of rock, or I'm doing the background with this new type of stuff that looks like this. And I think there's an opportunity for us, especially as we get more and more involved in the hobby, that you see something and you're inspired by it and you're like, I can make that 1% better. Like I can tweak it a little bit and it'll look like something I've seen, or it looks like what I'm trying to picture in my mind. And so I think I get inspired by seeing other people and what they've created. It really becomes artistry. It really does.
That's awesome. We created a riverbed aquascape.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I found that was really interesting and also really inspiring is people who haven't yet, done a freshwater aquarium, they looked at it and they're like, that reminds me of what I love outside of the business. That reminds me of my hiking trips. That reminds me that I'm a fisherman. That, and it's like they're starting to see, like, I can bring a little piece of what I'm connected to outside inside, right? And so do you find that, I mean, you were just talking about how you get that inspiration from travel. Do you see that in your customers as well, that they're trying to create environments that they've actually like touched, they've been a part of, and they're trying to bring that inside? Is that part of it?
Yeah, and I think it goes both ways. Like I think they're creating maybe parts of what they've seen in the wild, or even a picture of what they've seen in the wild, and be able to say, hey, like I have a piece of a South American rainforest in my house here in Tennessee. Like that's pretty amazing. But I think it works the other way as well too. Like I think as people bring this nature into their house and they set it up in a way that looks naturalistic, in a way that looks like what it would look like outside, they get more connected to what it is outside. I think that allows them to be more cognizant of conservation issues, to be more cognizant of how we're using our resources and how we're protecting our earth. And I think it goes both ways, that we're taking what's outside, bringing it into our house, but we're also being reminded of like, hey, there's a world outside of this concrete jungle that we need to protect and we need to be conscious of. And there's a lot of research that shows that people who keep either aquariums or terrariums are much more concerned with conservation. And I think it's helpful to bring the rhythm of nature into our houses. I think it's healthy for us to be grounded that way, but also healthy for us in how we think about the world outside of our homes.
Yeah, I agree. There's something about that primal connection to nature, right? And we see it in research that's shown that aquariums can lower heart rates, and you just can find that calm. Sometimes not so much when you're making them, and it's not going the way you want it to. Or you show up and there's a bunch of algae in it. Maybe your heart rate goes up a little bit, but ultimately the experience is. That connection to nature, that connection to DIY. I really have a propensity for this because I'm into woodworking. And just that same way in which you can work with your hands, and regardless of what the rules might be that you read about, and those can sometimes be intimidating, you can make something that you find beautiful, which is a lot of fun. I'm curious, where do you go from here at Josh's Frogs? Like, what are the trends? What mentioned paludariums is something that you're seeing more of. What's next for you? What are you excited about? What's going on?
So I think for us, there's a lot of things that are exciting. I think as a hobby, we're becoming more and more creative, and that's really cool for us to look at and say, hey, somebody created something and they're doing something in a cool way. Like how do we take what they're doing and apply it to the general public and give them access to be able to do that? And so that's a really cool thing that we're able to do. I think secondly, I think we're getting more and more creative in how we design terrariums that really mimic, and aquariums that really mimic the habitat of animals. And the more we're able to do that, I think the more we're observing natural behaviors in these animals. And that's really cool. I think that's the direction that we're heading in both hobbies. And then the third thing that I think is really cool is that we've become more and more concerned with what we're feeding to our animals. So it used to be in the past, like everything just ate crickets, that's all we had access to. And now the availability of different feeder insects has just blossomed. And it's really cool that people are really taking that and saying, hey, my animal needs to have a varied diet, just because it's more healthy, but also because it allows that animal to engage differently with what they're eating. And then it gets to the point where we're even taking better care of these feeder insects than we ever would have. We're treating them as animals, and we're treating them as pets. And then even collectors, we're taking some of these bugs, maybe it's isopods, and we're collecting all the different species and using those in our terrariums. It's really cool that I think our hobby is becoming more and more complex, but not in a way that gatekeeps and keeps people out from it, but in a way that allows people to say, hey, let's come into our hobby, learn how to do these types of things, and continue to grow with our hobby. And I think that's really cool that we're doing that as a hobby. It's becoming something that's becoming more and more a part of our everyday lives, instead of a, set it up, goes in the corner of your living room and you don't think about it until it's really dirty and you need to clean it, to something that you're really engaged in, that really drives some of the day-to-day activities that you have with your animals and the way in which you engage in our hobby. And I think that's really cool for us as a hobby. I think the more we're engaged with it, the better we're going to take care of these animals, but also the better we're going to take care of our planet.
No doubt. Yeah. I mean, I think that inspiration, bringing that inside, makes perfect sense. I'm curious, though, where do you see kids interacting in your world, right? I mean, are people starting really young, or is it more adults that are getting into reptiles and amphibians? How's that look?
So I guess I would say, on a personal standpoint, nothing makes me more excited than when a kid is at the reptile show and checking out the animals. Like, nothing makes me more excited about that, because I think that when we engage kids in our hobbies, I think we create lifetime members of our hobby, and I think that's really helpful, especially with the direction we're going as a hobby, where things are getting more and more and more complex, and we're able to do more and more types of things. It's going to take decades for people to get really good at some of the stuff that we're going to be able to do in the future. And I'm really excited about the engagement with kids in our hobby. I think that that's really cool. And I think the kids in our hobby tend to think of keeping things a little bit different than some of us old fogies like myself, where they're really, really engaged with the concern of where our planet is heading and the animals that we're keeping, and they're making that connection right from the get-go. And I think that's really cool for what that means for us as a species moving forward. The kids are engaged with that and are finding ways to have a real impact in conservation because they're keeping animals and are engaged in that conversation.
That's awesome.
Yep.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, even my kids at home, when they come up to the aquarium, you see that light in their eyes, and you go, you know what? I bet you're going to be into this.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yep,
and you're right. They're going to get into it with that mindset that is about the creatures and about the environment, and they're going to connect it to outside, maybe more so than we ever have in the past.
Yeah, and I think especially too in our culture, not to get too off topic, but like I think we're a very screen-heavy, phone-heavy, tablet-heavy upbringing for a lot of these kids.
If you have any screen time rules that you can share with me for my kids,
exactly.
Help me out.
Yeah, it's a constant battle, and I think the more that we can engage kids in things that are natural and also the things that are creative, like, just have such a huge benefit. And I think that keeping animals is a great opportunity for parents to do that with their kids. It's just an easy way to do it. It's something that naturally is engaging and exciting, and I think it's a really cool opportunity for parents to look at as an alternative to screen time.
Yeah, remind them how beautiful the outdoors is, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I love it. I think that's a great mission. I think what you guys are doing is super cool. I really appreciate you spending time out here with us, coming to our studio, which is blossoming and getting started. And you mentioned paludariums earlier, and you and your team are going to help us build out a paludarium and a terrarium, really joining kind of our two worlds together. I'm really excited to get started with that. I think it's time to go.
Yeah, sounds good. Looking forward to it, Jesse.
Let's do it. All right, thanks, Josh.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoy this content and want to stay up to date, make sure to like, subscribe, and follow us across social media. We always want to bring you the best content, so let us know what you think in the comments. And for all your reptile and amphibian needs, be sure to check us out at joshsfrogs.com. We have an amazing selection. Until next time, stay curious, stay froggy, and keep exploring.